Hello YouTube, this is Emails03. So we've already had 45 lessons where I've demonstrated and I've shared my knowledge and my understanding of the Java fundamentals with the YouTube community. And we've already learned how to do a wide variety of things with the Java programming language. We've learned about how to print statements. We've learned about arithmetic expressions, data type conversions, boolean expressions, if-else logic. We've learned about different types of loops. We've learned about the character data type, one-dimensional and two-dimensional arrays, the math class, the scanner class, static methods. We learned about overloaded methods, void methods, instance methods. We learned about basically object-oriented programming, constructors, getter methods, setter methods, the toString method, public variables, private variables, protected variables, subclasses, superclasses, abstract classes, inheritance, polymorphism, bubble sort, insertion sort, selection sort, linear search, binary search, recursion, Java docs. So hopefully these are all, exceptions and formatted strings, System.out.println. So we really talked about all of those things, and hopefully those sort of concepts are clear to you. What I wanted to do in this video, on this screen here, basically what we did throughout the span of these 45 lessons is we created a lot of classes. And so we had these different Java files, these different classes within BlueJ, where we were demonstrating different concepts within the Java programming language, right? And we had different examples of inheritance and abstraction, and that's why we had the waiter class, and then branching off of the waiter class was this cool waiter subclass. So hopefully you're familiar with some of the architecture that we've discussed in previous videos, under the assumption that you've been following along the whole time. But if you haven't, in this lesson, what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk about loops, okay? And so we've already had 3 lessons on loops, and we've already learned about 3 types of loops in Java, and we've learned about how to compare and contrast them, and hopefully you feel like we've presented enough examples of how to use the 3 different types of loops, as well as what the trade-offs and the benefits of each of them are, right? So we talked about a while loop, and we talked about a traditional for loop, and then we talked about a for each loop, okay? And so the goal in this video is to basically develop one more type of loop, which is not used anywhere near as commonly in traditional software engineering, but the more the merrier, and the more ways and the more options that you have for completing a task, it's kind of fun to have that freedom, and it doesn't hurt to learn a new way of doing things. So we're gonna come up with a new type of loop in this video. But what we're going to do is we're going to think about a task. So we're going to be given a 2-dimensional array of characters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to link to another video in the description where I link to the video that explains the character data type. So one of the things we said is that Java has 4 primitive data types. There's int, double, boolean, and char for character. And we had a 20-minute lesson on what the character data type is. And basically we said that characters are enveloped in single quotes, and they store one character, whether it's a capital A, whether it's double quotations, whether it's a lowercase o, whether it's the plus sign, whether it's the @ symbol, whether it's the dollar sign. Okay, and so you should be able to be familiar with that, and you should understand that these are examples of characters, and also that this is an example of a 2-dimensional array, which is really a 1-dimensional array of 1-dimensional arrays. How many 1-dimensional arrays do we have? 4. How many elements does each of the 1-dimensional arrays have? 3. Okay, so really there's 12 elements sort of total in this 2-dimensional array. So hopefully that's clear to you. But what I wanted to remind you in this video is about ASCII values, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be given a 2-dimensional array of characters, as we've already seen on this line. It's called character matrix, and you can see we have a 1-dimensional array with 3 elements, 1-dimensional array with 3 elements, 1-dimensional array with 3 elements, 1-dimensional array with 3 elements. And so given this 2-dimensional array of characters, the goal is to print the sum of the ASCII character codes in each of the 1-dimensional arrays within the 2-dimensional array. So let me remind you what ASCII character codes are. What you're going to do is you can go to a search engine like Blackle, which I explained at the beginning of the tutorial videos, was a way to either protect the environment over Google or to protect your wallet over forking more pennies over to the electric company. But anyway, what you could do is you could go ahead and you could do a search on, you could do ASCII table Java, okay? Because what you want to try to do is get ASCII values, and we want to basically figure out that there's an integer representation, there's an integer encoding of every character on your keyboard. So the left parentheses has a character code, it's 40. The capital F has a character code, it's 70. The lowercase t has a character code, it's 116. And when we were talking about implicit casting and when we were talking about data type conversions, we said that ints are automatically converted to doubles. That's called an implicit cast. We said that doubles are automatically converted to strings. That's called an implicit cast. And we said that characters are automatically converted to ints. So if you tried adding 0 to a character, it would give you the ASCII representation of that character, because by virtue of adding 0 to a character, you are converting that character to its integer representation, to its ASCII value. And then of course, adding 0 to that ASCII value at that point has no numerical effect. So hopefully what we're going to do here is we're going to have 4 different ways of doing the same thing. So we want to print the sum of these 3 character codes. So the character code for capital A, and the character code for a $, and the character code for a period. Okay, so if we looked up those 3 things, for a capital A we have 65. For a $, we have 36. So the sum of those will be 101. And then for a period we have 46. Okay, so 101 plus 46 is 147. Okay, so the first number that we're expecting to get, we could write it anywhere, but we could say that the first sum for the character codes that we expect for these 3 is 147. So hopefully that's clear to you, and we've already talked about that in a previous video. What we're going to do is we're going to have a nested while loop. And so we're going to have one while loop that'll keep track of the one-dimensional array that we're on within the two-dimensional array. And then within that, we're going to have another while loop that'll keep track of the particular element that we're on within one of the one-dimensional arrays. So the array 1 is going to refer to the one-dimensional array that we're on, and we'll start that at 0. We'll declare and initialize a variable called array1, initializing it to 0. And we've also declared, without initializing, 2 integer variables called sum and element. And then we're going to say while array1 is less than character matrix dot length. Remember, calling dot length on an array is a property, and it gives it the fixed constant. It determines the fixed constant length, the number of elements in this two-dimensional array. The number of elements in a two-dimensional array is the number of one-dimensional arrays that the two-dimensional array holds. So hopefully that's clear to you. So that will be 4 here, okay? And then what it's going to do is it's going to initialize sum and element to 0, because we need to initialize sum to 0 every time we look at one of these one-dimensional arrays, right? We're going to want to start the sum back at 0. And then we need to initialize the element to 0, because every time we look at one of these one-dimensional arrays, we're going to want to start off by looking at the first element. So this is basically the grounding. This is the initialization for the inner while loop, okay? Array1 equals 0 is the initialization for the outer loop. Element equals 0 is the initialization for the inner loop. And so you say, while element is less than character matrix of array1 dot length. So this is referring to the one-dimensional array, right? And then the dot length property, that gives you the number of characters in each of the one-dimensional arrays, okay? And so that would be 3 each time. So it says while element is less than 3, I want you to basically add the character at that index position. But remember, it's an implicit cast. So we say adding a character to an int produces an int, okay? So this is going to add the ASCII values of each of the elements in each of the one-dimensional arrays. And then, you know, at the end of this outer while loop for each of the one-dimensional arrays, because not for each of the elements. For each of the elements, that's what the inner while loop is for. The outer while loop is for each of the one-dimensional arrays. So for each of those, you'll just print the sum of the ASCII values. And the reason why we say sum and then array1 plus 1 is because you have to remember that arrays are indexed in Java starting at position 0. So if you wanted to say like sum number 1 and then sum number 2 and then sum number 3 and then sum number 4, you would just add 1 to the traditional index position. So now hopefully this sort of, you know, nested while loop architecture is clear to you. I know we've only seen a limited number of examples with nested loops, but basically this is going to have the effect of summing the character codes in each of the one-dimensional arrays. And I think we said that we were expecting to get 147 for the first value. So hopefully that's clear to you. We can also do this with a for loop. So then if we wanted to have very similar architecture, what we could do is we could have something very similar going on here. So what we could do is we're going to have very similar variables, but we could say for int array2 equals 0, and then you would say array2 is less than character matrix dot length. Okay, so then this is basically a formulation of a for loop. And we said that a for loop is very similar to a while loop. The difference is that the initialization of the counting variable, the boolean to check against, and then the increment or decrement of the counting variable all happen in the same line, okay? And then so what we're going to do is the same kind of thing is going to happen. You could say something like sum equals 0. You know, you could use the same variable name. You would just have to reset it to 0 every time. And then you would have to reset, you know, you could say basically at this point, you could say for int my element equals 0. You know, this would be a formulation of how to do this with a for loop. And then you would say my element is less than, and then you could say character matrix of array2 dot length. And then you would say my element plus equals 1. And it's the same kind of formulation here. So you should be really comfortable at this point going back and forth between a for loop and a while loop and being able to characterize, to compare and contrast the differences between them. Okay, so now you would just go ahead and say sum plus equals, and then you would say character matrix of array1 of array2 of my element. Okay, so hopefully that's clear to you. We're just having slightly different variable names here. And then you don't really need any other code. I guess at this point now you would just have the print statement. So you would just say System.out.println, and you could really just go ahead and copy and paste this same line. You would just have to change, instead of calling the array1 variable, you'd be calling the array2 variable, right? And so this would have the exact same effect. And so now if you go ahead and run it, then you see basically the duplicate code. So this was with the while loop implementation, and this was with the for loop implementation. We could also do this with a for each loop. So let's think about how we would do this with a for each loop. Basically what we could do is, remember, a for each loop is very compact syntax. So then what we could do is we could say for each of the one-dimensional character arrays in the two-dimensional arrays. So you could say my array or something in character matrix, right? So this is basically how we reference each of the elements in an array, right? But in a two-dimensional array, each of the elements is a one-dimensional array. So hopefully that's clear to you. And then you could say for each of the characters, and then you could say, you know, sample element in my array. And then at that point, you would just want to go ahead and you would want to start out the sum at 0 every time again. But then at this point, inside of the nested for each loop, you could say sum plus equals character matrix, or you could just say sample element, right? You would just say sample element, because now you're arbitrarily referring to each of the characters in the my array, where my array arbitrarily refers to each of the one-dimensional arrays, each of the one-dimensional arrays in the two-dimensional array. Okay, so this would be, again, another way of doing the exact same thing, right? And then you could basically say System.out.println, and then you could say like sum here, right? And then you could just have the sum. And here with the for each loop, we're not really keeping track of a counting index so much anymore. So it would be a little bit trickier to figure out a counting index. But here, again, it would have the same effect, and you would be able to print the sum of the three character codes for each of the four one-dimensional arrays. There's one more loop that we could talk about, and that's called a do-while loop, okay? And so basically the way that a do-while loop works, okay? So hopefully you're familiar with the for loop architecture here and the for each loop architecture. Maybe I'll keep it up. Well, let's go ahead and delete it. So feel free to rewind if any of that's unclear to you. But basically what happens is with a do-while loop, this is very similar to a while loop, but the loop's boolean is not checked until after the body is executed. Okay, so here's the difference. With an original while loop, or with the traditional while loop, we check the loop's boolean, okay? Run the loop body exactly once every time the boolean is true, right? And then we just keep checking that loop's boolean, remember, at the top of the loop. And then every time it's true, we run the code. If it started out false, we never run the loop body. If it's always true, we're going to run the loop body forever. In that kind of a case, we'd be talking about breaking out of the loop. We'd use a break statement. Okay. If the boolean starts false, the loop never executes. Okay. But with a do while loop, okay, this loop body always executes at least once, even if the boolean of the loop is never true. So let me show you what I mean by that. What we're going to do is we're going to basically accomplish the exact same task as we did as we did up here, but we're going to do it with a do while loop. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say int array2 equals 0. So then this is going to be an example of how it's similar to a regular while loop, but then I'm going to want to show you an example of how it's different from a regular while loop, okay? And then what you're going to say is you're going to write the word do, okay? You're just going to write the word do like that, because this is the architecture of a do while loop, okay? And then the while statement, the loop's boolean, isn't going to be checked until after the loop body has already run one time. So instead of saying, oh, check the boolean, and then if the boolean's true, run the code, basically the architecture now is run the code if the boolean is true. But it's like you can't even check to see if the boolean is true until you run the code. So at least the loop body will execute once, and that's the difference. That's the distinction to be made between a regular while loop and a do while loop. Okay, so then this boolean here, that the outer do while loop's boolean to check is to see whether array2 is still less than character matrix dot length. Okay, so hopefully that's clear to you. But then inside here, what we would be doing is we have to be careful about this, right? So we would basically say, we could say sum equals 0 and element equals 0. And then what we would do is we would say do, and then we would just have to have another do while in here. So this is an example of a nested do while loop. And then you would say element is less than character matrix of array2 dot length. This would be the inner do while loop's main boolean. Okay, so hopefully this is all clear to you. And then what actually goes in here? So then what's going to happen in here is you would basically be saying sum plus equals, and then you would say character matrix of array2 of element, right? And then you would have to go ahead and increment elements in the inner do while loop, and then in the outer do while loop, right? Once you finish the inner do while loop, right? Once you're done with that particular sum, you're going to go ahead and print the sum, and then you have to increment array2, because then you have to look at the next one-dimensional array and then start the outer while loop over again. So now if you say System.out.println of sum, right, and then you could have the same kind of thing. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this because I want to leave enough time to show you how this is actually a little bit different from a regular while loop. So then if you go ahead and say array2 plus equals 1, and so this would be a nested do while loop implementation of, again, how you would get the exact same results. So now if you go ahead and run the regular while loop implementation and the do while loop implementation, you get the same thing. The only thing that I forgot was that I don't have a hashtag on the do while loop implementation, but it's the same stuff. Okay, here's the difference. What if I had changed the main loop's boolean? What if I had said something like array1 is less than -4? So we know basically that if a boolean for a regular while loop starts out false, if it's false the first time that the boolean is checked, then the loop's body never runs. The while loop is sort of disregarded. They say, okay, all bets are off. So much for that. So much for writing a while loop that never checked, right? The loop body never executed because this boolean is always going to be false, right? If you initialize 0 and 0 is 0 less than -4, no, it's not. So nothing's going to happen, right? But then what's going to happen is with a do while loop, you don't check the boolean until after you've already run the loop's body once. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the same loop. I'm going to have the same main boolean. I'm going to say that we're going to run this code. We're going to, print these sums for the ASCII character codes while array2 is less than -4. The problem is that 0 is not less than -4. So the question is, how much of this stuff are we going to print? What's going to print? So hopefully you can make a prediction about what's going to be printed on the console. What's going to happen now? Because now we're going to run the while loop implementation of this task and the do while loop implementation. But with the while loop implementation, what I'm predicting is that we're not going to get any output because 0 is not less than -4. With the do while loop implementation, we are going to run the loop body once, and we're going to do it with an array2 value of 0, okay? And that's what's going to happen. So we are going to have the effect of running the first sum, but then, 0 is not less than, and then it's going to increment array2 from 0 to 1, but 1 is not less than -4. So it's just going to basically execute the loop body one time rather than 0 times, and that's why you just get one sum printed. The regular while loop iterated 0 times, the do while loop iterated 1 time, okay? In the normal case, they both iterate 4 times because there were 4 one-dimensional arrays. but in the do while loop, it iterates one time because the loop body is checked once regardless. In the original while loop, it ran 0 times because the loop's boolean was checked first and started out false. So hopefully that gives you an understanding of the difference between regular while loops and do while loops, and hopefully that was interesting. From you, Mills03, thanks for watching, and please subscribe.